Flipping the Table.
I wanted to take a second to thank our sponsors, Whole Foods Market, the Public Health Institute, and Roots of Change. Without their help, we couldn't present this podcast. Hello, this is Michael Reed Dimmock, and you're listening to Flipping the Table, a podcast featuring honest conversations and brief commentaries about the future of food and farming. I'm inspired by the thousands of farmers, ranchers, entrepreneurs, activists, and policymakers across this nation who are meeting the many challenges related to nutrition, poverty, pollution, and climate. This podcast highlights the people and actions making our planet and communities healthier and more resilient. I hope to inspire listeners to use their food purchases and their votes, our democracy, to flip the table in support of a new and better food system for us all, to be part of the delicious revolution now underway. The nation's second largest city, Los Angeles, is a special place. It is home to a microcosm of the American people. 224 languages are spoken there. You can find every religion and political persuasion, from far left to far right. Its architecture is as diverse as its cultures, and its food scene is among the best in the nation. It's a mecca for the arts. My relationship to the city stretches back to 1979 when I entered UCLA, graduating in May of 1983. The light, the weather, the diversity has always quickened my spirit. It's a great city, the weight of which influences all of California, the nation, and the world, for its reach through entertainment, the arts, and business is global. Since 2010, when its formation was announced, Los Angeles has been home to a large and influential food policy council, one of the most, if not the most, successful in the nation. Some of you may remember our June 25th episode in which we covered the LA Food Policy Council's annual gala. It featured a brief interview with today's guest, Clare Fox. Clare is the council's executive director. She is one more great example of a powerful woman leader in the food movement. Clare is a third-generation Los Angelino. Her mother was a teacher, a union leader, and a writer, and her father ran a small business. She grew up among the city's ethnic diversity and focused much of her life on studying the disparities in justice and resources and pairing the relations among the city's many communities. She studied critical thought at Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts and urban planning at UCLA. She began her career in media, working for National Public Radio and Youth Radio, where she founded Q Radio, Youth Radio's first dedicated LGBTQ radio program, as well as Audio Postales, a bilingual exchange between youth in Los Angeles and Mexico City. She was a dancer and founding board member of Critical Mass Dance Company, which fosters the healing and empowerment of underserved girls and women. Drawn to the social justice opportunities that food system reform offers, she served on the task force that created the LA Food Policy Council in 2009 and 10 and became its leader in 2015. As you will hear in this lively conversation, Clare is inspired and inspiring. She is focused on action, making real changes that improve the lives of those most impacted by injustices in our system. Her great talent is for including many voices and rallying broad coalitions to align and effectively call for change. She and her many colleagues and allies have been incredibly successful creating new policy and practices that are now impacting the nation. I know you will enjoy getting to know Clare Fox. Thank you for listening. Welcome, Clare.
Thanks for having me.
It's so nice to be here in Los Angeles with you at the headquarters of the Los Angeles Food Policy Council. And we're going to talk about a bunch of stuff today, all the exciting things. I was saying to Patrick, our producer, that on the way down here, that I think the LA Food Policy Council has got to be the first, second, or third largest, most active food policy council in the country. So we're going to talk about that.
Awesome.
Before we get to that, I want to hear your story. I think everybody's going to be interested in knowing just how you came to your position as the head of it. What's the journey?
Okay. Wow. Well, so about 10 years ago, I was working in public radio. We were just chatting about that. And I was working with teenagers here in LA through an organization called Youth Radio. And my job as a radio producer was to help them tell their stories about the systems that impact them: education, healthcare, immigration, transportation. And it was such a privilege to support them in being able to tell their story to broader audiences. We got a lot of pieces placed on NPR. But I had this itching feeling that I wanted to do more to transform those systems. And at that same time, I myself, early 20s, was having kind of inexplicable chronic health issues. And I am a baby of the industrial food system all the way. I grew up on Pop-Tarts and Hot Pockets and LUSD school food. No offense to LUSD, but we're talking...
That's the Los Angeles School District.
Yeah, that's right. And they've made a lot of progress on their food
they sure have.
Since then, and in part thanks to the Food Policy Council's support. But it was just so strange to be young and have chronic fatigue and some other inexplicable health issues that really did stem from my diet. And I didn't grow up with a culinary tradition. So encountering the idea of food as medicine or healing the body through food was a really foreign concept. And so all of these things sort of converged at the same time when I decided to go back to school and study urban planning and community development. And it was my good fortune at the time that I was at UCLA studying urban planning that the mayor's office, then Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, and some of the leaders in his administration, Paula Daniels, Larry Frank, some other really inspiring folks, were talking about food and talking about food systems and thinking about what could the city of Los Angeles do on hunger, on food access, on food jobs and economic development. But think beyond the city of LA, think region-wide, think statewide. And so it was a very inspiring time that these conversations were happening, and I myself was healing my own body through food. So I was having a transformative experience, mind, body, and spirit, driven by food. Mm-hmm. And so the convergence of that opportunity to talk about food policy and food systems through the mayor's office, my orientation as an activist, and already understanding systems of oppression, and then my own healing journey around food painted a picture for me about how critical food is as a human rights issue. The fact that whole communities of color, low-income communities, are denied the opportunity to nourish over a lifetime, and the very real health ramifications of that really landed with me as a human rights crisis. And so at that point, I dedicated myself to working on food justice, and I had the opportunity to express that passion through what later and soon became the Food Policy Council here in Los Angeles. And that was back in 2011, 2012. So I've been working with this organization for 7 years. And then in 2015, when Paula, our founder, spun off the Center for Good Food Purchasing along with my colleague Alexa Delwich to work on the Good Food Purchasing program nationwide, that was my opportunity to step up and serve as the first executive director of the LA Food Policy Council.
Mm-hmm. Great. That is an exciting story. It gives me the chills because the idea that your personal internal journey around your own healing was in exact sync with what was going on here in the city where you reside and where you grew up, I assume.
Exactly.
And so that's a beautiful thing. You're indigenous to this topic and you're indigenous to this issue, and that's beautiful. So why don't you now tell folks what the LA Food Policy Council does, what its mission is, and what it does on a daily basis?
Sure. Our mission is to make food healthy, affordable, sustainable, and fair for all Angelinos. And we believe all communities deserve access to healthy food and good food. And when we talk about good food, we're talking about it holistically. We're talking about nutritious food, but we're also talking about food that's grown with respect to people and respect for the planet. And so that's the grand vision, right? That all people have access to good food grown with respect for people and the planet. And how do we do that on a day-to-day basis? Well, like many other food policy councils, we are designed to bring together diverse communities and stakeholders that represent the entire food system from farm to fork and beyond, and across sectors. So government and private sector and nonprofit and community groups working together in new ways and hopefully catalyzing systemic change through those partnerships. So written into our DNA is partnership and collaboration. And then from that ecosystem of collaboration, we're coming up with policy ideas. We're coming up with new programs, new initiatives. And so a lot of our work over the last several years has focused on expanding access to healthy food in underserved low-income communities here in Los Angeles. We do that through partnering with neighborhood markets, corner stores, street vendors, urban food gardeners, and really, honestly, a lot of it is decriminalizing innovation and activity that's already happening in communities. Communities are resilient, right? Communities are already feeding themselves. And there's a lot of, I think food is an entry point for all of us, right? Very low barriers to entry in terms of entrepreneurship. So a lot of our work is helping the law catch up to that, helping policy catch up to what communities are already doing.
Great. So give some examples, because I think there's some very clear examples around that so that people know the policy changes that you've advocated for.
Definitely. So, for example, many of us know the story of Ron Finley, the gangster gardener. So he was growing food in the parkway, which is that strip of land between the sidewalk and the street. A lot of times that space is kind of dumped on with trash. You see that a lot. Well, he turned it into a vibrant garden. He was feeding his neighborhood. He's an artist, so it was a beautiful addition to the neighborhood landscape. And he got in trouble. He got cited. The city of LA told him to dig out his garden. There were many other examples of that all across the city. People growing food for themselves and their communities and suddenly getting penalized. So a policy change that resulted from the publicity that Ron brought and then the advocacy work that we did is that now it's legal to grow edible gardens in parkways. And from there, we took it to the next scale, which is vacant lots, which is also a challenge we see in a lot of the neighborhoods that we work in. And so we were able to use that example of underutilized or blighted land, paint a picture of what's possible in terms of food gardens and urban farms, and achieve the Urban Agriculture Incentive Zone program, which actually came from a state bill, AB 551. We were able Filting, that's right. And we were able to win that at both a county and city level. So now we're seeing many community gardens and urban farms that are on private property benefiting from that, seeing those tax savings, and that savings helps them put more money back into their community programs. And then I'm happy to report later this month, we're celebrating with AFSC Roots for Peace program, the first vacant lot conversion in South Los Angeles, which is one of our largest food desert areas, into a beautiful community garden that includes an education space and an outdoor kitchen. And this
Where is that going to be?
It's in South LA. It's in Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas's district.
Great.
And it was this little patch of land that the community had their eyes on for years. And it was acquired by an affordable housing developer who said, we're building this affordable housing project right next to this lot. We don't know what to do with this funny shaped parcel that's right next to our development. And the community said, we want to plant a garden there. We want to grow food there. And so the affordable housing developer partnered with AFSC, Roots for Peace, partnered with us to leverage the Urban Ag Incentive Zone program, and now it's a garden right next to an affordable housing project as well. Another really great example, I think, of decriminalization and supporting food entrepreneurs is the work we've done around sidewalk vending. In Los Angeles, we estimate there's over 50,000 sidewalk vendors who have been working in the shadows for forever, really. And these are, folks who are selling fruit and corn and tacos and quesadillas and elotes, all the things we love, right? And they've been very harshly penalized, faced citations, confiscation of equipment, arrest, and in some cases, deportation as a result of being criminalized. And we've been working on this for a long time in solidarity with street vendors who organize themselves. It's a vendor-led movement. And essentially, vendors said, hey, we want to come out of the shadows. We're working. We're entrepreneurs. This is our business. And in LA, we celebrate street food as a part of our culture, but the law did not celebrate or support street vendors. So finally, in the last year, and really we had to take action at a state level, thanks to Senator Ricardo Lara, then senator, he really took up the issue and said, well, first and foremost, we got to decriminalize this. It's not a crime to work. And in the political era that we live in, for immigrant communities to be so vulnerable in terms of the criminal justice system is unacceptable. So we have to shore up our protections for our immigrant neighbors, right, and community members. And so he put forward SB 946, and we were really thrilled to see that move forward, which led to statewide decriminalization of sidewalk vending. And here in LA, that gave I think the final push that we needed to get a permit program. So next up will be a permit program for street vendors so that they can have that official seal and feel that protection and be legitimized as small businesses. And a part of that is a special seal for healthy food carts as a way to deploy healthy food into low-income communities.
Wow. All great examples of how people can make change, positive change. And I love the interaction at the as you were talking about both the Phil Ting's bill for creating incentives for urban agriculture and Senator Lara's efforts. He's now the commissioner, just for people to know, he's now the commissioner of insurance for the state of California. That interaction between the state and the local is really important. And I love the flow of a Southern California leader and a Northern California leader both participating in that, because I think there's this, people talk about the split between North and South, and I've seen over the years this incredible kind of flow between places. And I want to get into the Good Food Purchasing Program because that's another good example, because Roots of Change actually was worked with Paula to help start the LA Food Policy Council, which was kind of a North-South thing. And then the LA Food Policy Council and allies created the Good Food Purchasing Program, which went north to Oakland, and now it's national. So it's really exciting to see that cross-pollination that's going on in the food world, the food movement, I would call it. Before we go on with more details about different things that you've done, what I'd like to talk about is, like, who are the members? Describe some of the organizations that are the people that are participants in the Food Policy Council.
Right. Well, again, like many other food policy councils, we're looking to have a 360 view on our food system, and we're looking for perspectives that help paint the full picture of both what our challenges are, but also what our opportunities are. So in our work, I think of ourselves as a crossroads space for gardeners, farmers, chefs, producers, distributors, retailers, policymakers, community-based advocates, right, who are interested in issues as far-ranging as immigrant rights to health equity, to anti-displacement efforts, right? There's a lot of far-reaching synergy, because I think food brings together diverse communities like that. And so each working group is unique. We are home to an ecosystem of now 5 active working groups. Urban agriculture, food waste is another very popular working group. Good food purchasing, school gardens and farm to school. And we just launched a new working group called the Good Food Economy. And this is really focused on eliminating food deserts through equitable economic development initiatives. And we literally just had the kickoff meeting last week.
That sounds very exciting. And so Are you in communication with other food policy councils around the country? Is there a flow, or in the state, is there a flow back and forth where people are sharing and learning from each other?
Definitely. I mean, we've enjoyed very much our participation in the California Food Policy Council and some other statewide coalitions, California Food and Farm Network, for example. And that's helped us create especially more regional conversations because our food system doesn't end at the border of the city of LA or the county of LA for that matter. We belong to a regional ecosystem and a global food system. And so it's incumbent upon us to have those information flows and peer exchanges and learning happening. I'd love to be a part of more national conversations. I think that's probably the next step for us and also for California-based food organizations and food organizers. We have to broaden our horizons because, you brought up the Good Food Purchasing Program and its national scope now. Well, over time, it's been made evident that in particular regional markets, the needs and the concerns of communities are different, but the conditions we're contending with are very similar. And a lot of times the industry players that we're interacting with at the level of school food procurement or senior meals programs are the same companies. Mm-hmm. And so if they're hearing it in Los Angeles, but they're also hearing it in Oakland and then Minneapolis and Chicago and New York, suddenly we are really shifting the national food scene and conversation, and the writing's on the wall. The Good Food for All is the movement we need to go in.
Right. Okay, that's good. So why don't we jump into Good Food Purchasing Program, and then there's other things we're going to talk about, but let's do that now because I think it's a good segue.
Yeah.
Talk about what it is, how it started, and where it is.
Sure. The Good Food Purchasing Program began back in the early days of the Food Policy Council here in Los Angeles, when we were still very much nested within Mayor Villaraigosa's administration. It started as an idea about procurement and the power of the city's procurement, the food that the city of LA buys and serves through its own programs, whether that's senior meals programs or summer lunch programs in public parks or commissaries at parks or the Greek Theater, which is run by the city of LA. It's a lot of food. It's multiple $1 million worth of food. And then you look to Los Angeles Unified School District, second largest school district in the country, and they're buying and serving a lot of food as well.
Isn't it $70 million a year? I used to hear that number.
It's over $150 million a year of food purchases.
Wow.
So they're serving 700,000 meals a day.
Wow.
It's just a phenomenal impact, obviously on the health of our students, first and foremost, but also on the health of our region, the health of our economy, the health of workers that we see all up and down the supply chain. So it began with one of the Food Policy Council's working groups where you had a very diverse set of stakeholders all coming together saying, we want a better food procurement policy. Who was at the table? You had labor, you had animal rights activists, you had public health, environmentalists, people who were concerned with a local and regional food economy, including farmers and processors and distributors, all saying, hey, we want the city's food purchases to support our cause. And what was really beautiful about that process, and I always say the magic is in the working groups when you can get unlikely allies together, hearing from each other in a new way and cross-pollinating and coming to learn and respect each other's points of view. At first, they thought, we're asking for too much here. I mean, you're talking about animal welfare. I'm over here talking about workers' rights. This is just all over the map. But they stuck together and they worked together. And so slowly over time, they built this sense of solidarity and decided, you know what? It's all of us or none of us. We're going to ask for the moon.
Wow.
And so thus was born the Good Food Purchasing Policy. It was first adopted by the city of LA by mayoral executive directive, Mayor Villaraigosa. City council backed that up with their own motion. And then just a month later, LUSD also adopted at the school district at the level of the school board. What it is in a nutshell is a commitment to a percentage of the overall food purchases supporting 5 values. Those values are nutrition, local economies, environmental sustainability, animal welfare, and valued workforce or fair labor. So they're committing to meet a baseline of standards in each of those value categories, and they're committing at least 15% of the overall food purchases towards good food, right, that meets that baseline of standards. And then from there, hopefully increasing that commitment over time. But
from 15 to 20 to 25.
From 15 to 20 to 25. And also, when I say baseline standards, I mean, you're meeting minimum requirements in each category, but there's deeper levels of good that can be accomplished in each of those categories. And I love that part about this program, Michael, because it creates an entry point, It creates a pathway in to transforming an institution's approach to food. Bureaucratic institutions take a long time to change. There has to be an on-ramp. And this gave them a lot of options because it didn't say 100% organic, go, or 100% animal welfare, go. It said, start with a few best practices, get points in each of these categories. You can't opt out. You can't say, I love the animal welfare piece, but forget about the workers' rights piece. No, you can't opt out. You have to commit to all 5. And then from there, you grow and you get better over time. And that gives institutions like LA Unified School District a lot of options for sourcing, for managing budget, for changing menus. And it gives them that ability. Training their people, creating a culture of awareness. So in the early days, after adoption of the Good Food Purchasing Policy, it was a lot about capacity building and building up cultural awareness within the institution about, well, what are the animal welfare issues out there? If I'm a contract manager in the Department of Aging, do I necessarily understand what the issues are out there or what farm workers are facing? I'm not necessarily educated about that. And so that's a role for food policy councils and for food organizations is to build that awareness and to build that culture. And that really was the first, I'd say 3 years of the program was very focused on that, as well as devising a way to verify compliance.
Now, I was going to say, talk about that. That's interesting. Yeah. How did they do that?
And so because
I remember some issues coming up. Around poultry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, so the Food Policy Council, and really under Paula and Alexa's leadership, figured out the best way to take that purchasing data in. So we're working with the institution and then their supplier, and then trying to trace food purchases all the way down to the farm level. Honestly, Michael, that was the first step, was just transparency in the supply chain.
To see it.
Just to know what was going on.
Right.
Because here's, I'm this big institution, I have my big food supplier. Beyond that, I have no idea where the food really comes from and who else was touched along the way. So number one step was transparency. Illuminate where our public food dollars go all the way down to the farm level. And then with that newfound information, make some choices. And at that point, with just knowledge about what the impacts of our public food dollars were, the institutions had the ability to say, okay, well, we've got some issues in the supply chain. Maybe it's OSHA violations at slaughterhouses. Maybe it's a question about GMOs or about other kind of farming practices. Now that we have that information, we are empowered to talk to our supplier. We can ask our supplier to talk to their suppliers to course correct or not continue to do business together. I mean, at the end of the day, that's the power of procurement. It's the power of public dollars in reshaping economies. And so indeed, over time, when contracts would expire and it was time to put it to a bid, LUSD and the City of LA would put good food purchasing policy language in the request for proposals and say, hey, this is our commitment. We want to know from you, food suppliers out there, show us how you're going to help us achieve our own policy. And if you can't, then we just won't continue together. And so ultimately that did really change the landscape of the supply chain, especially for LUSD and particularly around poultry, where
it was labor issues, wasn't it? In the South, there were a couple of poultry plants that were mistreating people. Was that what it was?
Yeah, the Food Chain Workers Alliance is a national partner for the Good Food Purchasing Program.
Joanne Lowe, great
Joanne
leader.
Lowe, and partnering with some of our other labor friends at UFCW, had identified that there were some really egregious labor violations in poultry slaughterhouses, not just in the South, but across the country, and that those were, in fact, kind of muddled in the supply chain of LUSD. And so the biggest concern was about Tyson and their ability to help the school district achieve its goals. And ultimately, that company backed out of the bidding process, even though they had been a contract holder for a long time.
Wow.
They discontinued their interest in it because
they couldn't meet it.
I don't know the details of what their what their decision making was on the inside of the company, but ultimately they didn't move forward with pursuing the contract.
Interesting. Well, that's a beautiful example, and so let's just talk about the reach now, because it started here, but actually, I mean, in the scope of things, it went very quickly in terms of taking off to other places. So just tell people where
Good Food Purchasing
the Good Food Purchasing Program. Yeah.
I think out of the gate, there was a lot of interest nationally because it was the first food procurement initiative to thread together all those different issue areas. And to my knowledge, the first food procurement policy that really took labor seriously and included a worker rights perspective and worker health and safety perspective. And so there's always a lot of calls to the office from everywhere. How did you do it? How did you pull it off? And how's it going? And of course, the focus then was really building out the program and coming up with a process for assessing supply chains, giving that information to the institution, helping them build in new language in their contracts and their RFPs. But there came a time where it seemed that this thing was really well poised to move into new markets. And so Alexa and Paula saw that opportunity and seized on it. And it started first then with Oakland Unified School District and then San Francisco Unified School District. And now I believe they're in over a dozen cities and school districts across the country. The organization that oversees the initiative is the Center for Good Food Purchasing. So they really act as the third-party verifier that's working with institutions to analyze their supply chains and to get points and to get verified as a good food purchaser. And when that national spinoff happened, that in a way freed us up here locally to turn our attention to expansion locally, right? I mean, we had this win with the city, we had this win with LUSD. Of course, there's always need for maintenance and ongoing leadership development because we also saw a lot of turnover in leadership on both of those institutions.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
But it also gave us a chance to think about what's next locally. So we reconstituted the Good Food Purchasing Policy Working Group because it retired for a time period as we just went into implementation mode. We brought the band back together, got a working group going, a new set of characters, right? Because the movement keeps growing. That's the beauty of the food movement, is that we had new allies and new stakeholders to engage. So we organized that group of people and started to talk to our friends at the Department of Public Health at the county about what it would look like to expand the Good Food Purchasing Program county-wide. And now the county, believe it or not, serves 37 million meals every year.
Wow.
It's a just incredible breadth of food. Their purchasing power is about $29 million a year, just food purchases. So the impact that they can have is tremendous. So our focus for the last couple years has been in making the connection between procurement, food purchases, and county food programs that serve low-income families that are actually fighting food insecurity. And the best example of that is Summer Lunch Program, which fights childhood hunger in the summer months when kids are out of school. The county serves over 200,000 children every summer, free meals in the park. And it's such a great example of the impact that county food programs already have. And so how can we improve upon that impact by linking kids to food that is grown sustainably and ethically and regionally?
That's a beautiful program, and I'm Really glad. I'm hoping to see that level of implementation across the country. It will have a huge impact because, I mean, you just add up the numbers. It's going to be hundreds of millions of dollars, approaching billions in time. And that's what the market will respond to.
Exactly.
So, beautiful story. Example of the power of food policy council. So I want to talk to you about. You use the term food movement. I use the term food movement. I mentioned that I had done an interview the other day with Leah Penniman from Soulfire Farm. She's doing great work around her new book, Farming While Black, and
super inspiring work.
Super inspiring. And she did say something interesting in that interview that has had me thinking for a couple of days. She said she doesn't really call it a food movement unless those most affected are leading the movement. So one of the good things about Food Policy Council, it seems to me, is that because they're made up of large cross sections of communities and representatives, you're closer to that possibility. So do you believe that, because there are many organizations, nonprofits, that are in the food movement, Roots of Change is an example, but there are many others, Oxen Arts and Ecology Center, CalCan, there's all these different organizations. So my question is, do you feel that we have a food movement that's actually operational in the country? And do you feel that where do food policy councils fit in that movement in terms of typologies, if we're talking at the different species in the ecosystem?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do use the term food movement very intentionally because I think it's what we ought to aspire to. I think we need to take our work seriously. We were talking just before this interview about how the issue of food and food justice is an issue of life or death, truly. For communities of color, that's true. And it might be a slow death over a lifetime of being denied opportunities to heal and nourish.
And to suffer. They will suffer. People suffer.
Right. And so
you were suffering when you were.
That's right. I mean, so the quality of life question, the longevity of life question is very real when it comes to the denial of access to good, real food. And so I call on us to act as a food movement, to behave as if what we need is, and because truly what we need is the power of a people-driven food movement. And I completely agree with the sentiment that a true movement has to be led by the most impacted members of the community who know firsthand on the level of their body the assault of a racist, broken, industrialized food system. And we need to follow their leadership. And that's absolutely true. And to your point about the different typologies of organizations and different roles that we play within a movement ecosystem, I think food policy councils absolutely have a role. And the way I have always thought about our work is we're creating pathways of participation into the policy process. Policy by design is not inclusive.
Right.
It's very opaque, confusing, frustrating, and exclusive by design. And I would say that's also a manifestation of structural racism, as well as socioeconomic oppression and gender oppression, right? All we have to do is look to the history of our country to see who's been included in policy discussions and who's been left out, and the ramifications that that's had on people's health and well-being and ability to live and thrive. So creating a pathway to participation in policy is no small feat, but it is absolutely essential because policy governs the systems that govern our lives. They literally shape the environments that we live in. So if we're taking seriously this challenge that our zip code should not determine how long we live or what kind of health issues we're going to have in our lifetime, we have to reform policy. So who needs to be at the table shaping those policy conversations? So the food policy councils as an innovation in democracy, as an experiment in getting new kinds of people involved in collaborating around policy and really creating policy, right? My vision would be that everyone sees themselves as a policymaker and that the single mom who is working several jobs and, reliant on CalFresh to put food on the table for her family, that she sees herself as a policymaker because she has ideas about what can improve her circumstances, and those ideas should lead to policy reform. It's incumbent on our organization, as well as others that are in this space of food policy and food policy advocacy, to take seriously the barriers that people face to getting in the room just to have the conversation, right? In our own work, we have working groups. Great, they're open to anyone, come one, come all. But the reality is we're having them during the middle of the day. It tends to be a lot of 9-to-5 professionals who may come from impacted communities and represent that perspective, but might not be living that journey anymore, right? So we're still one step removed in a way. So we've had to really think about what are those real barriers to participation in terms of transportation, in terms of economic means, food, language barriers, right? And in the last year, we set out to create a new kind of space. We realized that our working group spaces and our community events, as far-reaching as they were, and you asked about, what's our reach today, and we have over 400 organizations participating actively in our working group ecosystem. It's really phenomenal. Mm-hmm. But how do we make sure that community residents who are living and breathing it day in and day out and who are suffering are leading? Mm-hmm. So that's the sort of framework and thinking that went into the launch of Food Leaders Lab, which is a new program that's a leadership development program entirely oriented around the leadership participation of low-income communities of color who are suffering the most in our damaging and unjust food system. And my vision and my hope is that the Food Leaders Lab, as it continues to grow, we just graduated the first cohort of 15 community residents, which, by the way, came to us through partnership with community-based organizations that are doing on-the-ground work. So we, humbly come to this and say, hey, we've historically been a policy organization. We need to partner with people who have been doing community organizing work and look to them to identify the leaders in their midst. And then together, we'll support them in their journey as food policy advocates. So we're simultaneously investing in the capacity and the power of residents to lead, but also we're growing our collective power and we're building up our collective base, right, to operate as a movement. Right. So it's base building, but kind of beyond one individual organization, thinking about ourselves as a constellation of food-oriented, food justice organizations, taking ourselves seriously and then lifting up the members of our community that we're in service to as our leaders. And I was going to say, my hope is that the next generation of policy work that we do will come right out of Food Leaders Lab. Mm-hmm.
Right? Okay, that's very cool. It seems that in a way, though, I have to give you credit, though, because the work that you did around sidewalk vendors was really, that came from those communities, those people that were most impacted.
Yep.
And that
was our compass. I mean, that was really, right, of all of our policy work, we said, well, how can we get closer to what we're doing in the street vendor campaign, where it's vendor-led? And it's challenging.
I remember, it's very challenging. I think that's the hope that I have around the food movement is that it is getting more grounded in place and in communities. I do see that. I think there were people early on. I was part of it because, I didn't grow up in that situation where hunger was a challenge, so that's not the way I came into it. So I think my generation was more removed, and I think the big thing that's happening now is that there are people who are from communities that are leading. And it actually reminds me, the process you described reminds me of the conversation I had with Navina Khanna about HEAL.
Yeah.
It's a very similar process, but on a national level, working with organizations that are rooted in places, the South, different places around the country where there's good work going on. And are you guys part of, is LA Food Policy Council part of HEAL?
No, not directly.
Okay, yeah. That's, I think one thing that would strengthen HEAL is to have more food policy council-oriented organizations or food policy council-like organizations to be part of it, because you are, by your nature, your members are representatives of communities, or are meant to be. So I really like this idea of the Food Lab, Leaders Lab.
Well, this
Go ahead.
idea
Yeah.
about, I think, leadership development, we actually did reach out to HEAL and had a great conversation with their political director about the leadership development training work that they're doing. And I think with the launch of the Castanea Fellowship and other initiatives that we're seeing, coming out of the Wallace Center, for example, the Food Systems Leadership Network, there's a lot of zeitgeist, I think, around this idea of growing our leadership capacity and growing our chops as organizers and as movement builders. I wonder, Michael, if something that has limited us to date in that area is a lot of food work, community food work, has been driven by public health, which has been great and essential. And the public health field has just moved leaps and bounds in terms of understanding social determinants of health, in terms of having more of an equity conversation. But public health, let's go back to that working group meeting I was telling you about, where the Good Food Purchasing Policy was born. Public health was one of many stakeholders at the table shaping the conversation. So our lens has widened, and I think we're now pulling into our food movement people with expertise and experience from very diverse sectors and with very different kinds of backgrounds, including community organizers, right? People who come out of immigrant rights movements or people who come out of right to the city work. And that perspective, which is rooted in very long histories of social movements and social justice organizing, is what we need to build up more. I think that's a muscle we need to work in the food movement so that we can have real coordinated impact. And, I want to say that the work that you've done and the incubation of the California Food Policy Council in particular is such a great example of that, like looking up and looking beyond our individual, community garden program or farmers market program, and thinking as a whole ecosystem and having that sense of deep solidarity.
Yeah.
We are much farther along than we were even just 5-10 years ago, right?
That's true.
And so now the next level is really taking ourselves seriously as a movement.
Yeah, that's what excited me when I first arrived and we had that brief conversation and you brought that up. I mean, I think it's true. And I think part of the problem is what I was saying, the generation that I came from, it was a lot of people who had a vision and understood the problem, but they weren't of the problem. I mean, they weren't rooted in the problem. Not all of them. The world, the food movement's complex, so I'm generalizing. But the piece that I came from, like either the slow food movement or the environmental side, organics. I mean, it's totally legitimate and absolutely important and essential, but it is only one fractal in a much larger jewels, let's say. So, and that's where the power comes from. It has to get bigger.
Yeah.
You have to have that wide scope, as you've so beautifully described. And so, let's move into your thought about. I mean, it sounds, I would assess from what you said so far, you are very positive about the future of the food movement or our ability to win. I mean, you're winning locally. So I want to hear how you feel about the future, but also I want to hear where you feel like we're weak, where we got to get better, where we're not winning, where we should win.
Mm-hmm. I am optimistic, but I am an optimist. I'm optimistic because I see, as I mentioned, just that there's more synergy nationally. There's a conversation about community organizing and leadership development like we've never seen before. I think the realities of climate change are already upon us in the United States, and people are, building that connection and realizing that our food system and agriculture has such a huge impact there. I could even just point to things like food waste as an issue. It wasn't even mentioned in the original Good Food for All agenda, which is our founding collective vision. Right. It wasn't even really talked about. And we did a big refresh on the Good Food for All agenda in 2017, and it was a core galvanizing issue. So there's broader public awareness. There's a lot more capacity in the space, many more organizations, but our organizations, I think, are becoming much more sophisticated in our approach. I'll give you another example. Food deserts or food apartheid, unequal access to healthy food. In our work, all roads keep leading us back to the economy, right? And sort of the nature of how structural racism has created racial wealth disparity, and that is the underlying issue that goes into the neighborhood conditions we would describe as food deserts or food swamps or food apartheid. So instead of just intervening at the level of access, bring the basket of fresh fruits and veggies, we're now intervening at the level of economic development and economic repair, reparations.
Which is the root.
Getting closer to the root issues.
Right.
And it's not just us. Yeah. This is a conversation that now we see everybody having. We're talking about equitable, food-oriented development. I'm so thrilled to see the community market opening up in Oakland finally after, so much work going into that. And I think financing in this space is becoming a lot more sophisticated and taking more risks and realizing it's not just about access. Just bringing in the fruits and veggies is not transforming conditions.
Right.
So that's what I'm optimistic about, is that we're getting to those root issues. Where do we need to be stronger? In our work, I would say, and I think that this might be true for others as well, we don't have a lot of opposition in terms of, everyone politically, our local elected officials agree everyone should have healthy food. It's a question of prioritization.
Right.
It's still seen as sort of a boutique issue, even though food is literally essential for human life. It's not boutique in any way. It's fundamental in every way, profoundly fundamental and profoundly uniting and profoundly impactful. We were talking earlier about this being truly a life or death issue. That hasn't gotten across yet. I don't
see the same thing in Sacramento.
Okay.
Same thing.
I think funders aren't fully there yet.
Right.
I don't, elected officials, you have those friendly sidebars in the halls of, the Capitol building. Sure, sounds great. Of course we support, but then at the end of the day, the real backing isn't there and the real funding isn't necessarily there. And so we have to elevate our issues to make them a priority.
Yeah, I agree. I think I'm watching it right now at the state level. We talked a little bit about the sweetened beverage tax and the inability to move beyond the first committee this year, and that's really that's because there are 3 or 4 other priorities in the legislature around taxes, and they don't want to take this up. And also they don't want to feel the pain from this when they know they're going to feel pain from other things. So what that says is it's not a priority. It's not a high enough priority. It's higher than it was a few years ago. And the question is, and I think you've actually already discussed and pointed out what the solution is. It's the organizing of the broad base that's going to call for it. That's the only way to move it up the ladder. The issue of housing in California is so huge because there's so many people affected.
Yes.
And you can't avoid it. It's like it's in your face. If you live, I live in a suburb, not a real town, a town, Santa Rosa, California. There are homeless people everywhere in my community, and there weren't 10 years ago. I'm here with my producer, Patrick, who lives near me, and there are homeless people everywhere where we live.
Everywhere.
It's incredible. So, it really, I understand why that is the priority right now, because we're all facing it. Again, food apartheid, it's a smaller community that's facing it. And that's the tragedy.
It's not being identified as such. And even, I would argue, for many low-income communities, it might not be the top priority when they're trying to just pay the rent.
Right.
And so, it's not that it's not a real issue.
It's a total issue.
There's a lot of other issues that are impacting communities and are pulling their attention, and the pain point is being felt not as acutely, or let's say not as isolated on the issue of food, but food is contributing to an overall experience of suffering that's coming from all these. It's multi-directional, right?
That's right. Actually, what you said earlier also about the economics, getting into the root causes within the economy, because the problem is actually the economy.
Yes.
It's actually way that we practice capitalism.
Yep.
It's capitalism is the problem in the end. Capitalism and racism, that interaction between those two modalities of action in the world are the underlying thing. Food is the lens.
Exactly.
And it's a powerful lens because everybody eats, as you said. So we have to close. We're running out of time. So I want you to just offer to us what you think. I mean, a couple of things. Maybe you can mention. How can people help you? How can anyone that's listening help the LA Food Policy Council do its work? And then what would you like to leave our listeners with?
Well, in terms of helping or getting involved, if you're here locally in Los Angeles, of course, you're more than welcome to join us in a working group or at one of our regular network events.
And you have a big event coming up in June.
We have our biannual gala, June 20th. It's called the Good Food Gala. It'll be at Vibiana's in downtown LA, and tickets are on sale for that, where the whole thing started. And you were there, Michael.
Yeah.
And Vibiana has continued to be a really special place for us. The owners of the building are really supportive of our work, and that's the place where Mayor Villaraigosa announced the Good Food for All agenda and announced that he was going to create the Food Policy Council. So come celebrate with us.
I'm going to come, June 20th.
And that's a huge, important fundraiser for our work.
Yes.
You know, I mean, we're a small but mighty organization, and we're growing. And I would say, you know, just parting thoughts, I think, to your point about it's the economy and it's kind of our historic inheritance around a fundamentally racist and extractive and exploitative economic paradigm. We got to build the alternative. And that's what I'm really excited about, is I think food as a movement space is, I'm going to say, inherently about healing, inherently about nourishment, inherently about solutions. Unlike other segments of social justice work, I'm just going to say that, right? Sometimes social justice work has to be reactionary and has to be defense-oriented. You know, we're going to fight back. Well, food has always given us a pathway towards something else that's possible, healing justice, right? How do we feed ourselves? And that's why I think the work that Leah Penniman's doing is so phenomenal, because she's showing that. So we got to build the good food economy. We have to model it. We have more examples now more than ever, but we have to amplify the impact of what we're doing. So the work we're doing in neighborhood markets to transform them, not just in terms of the basket of fruits and veggies, but wholehearted bricks and mortar transformation, that has catalyzing effects for the entire neighborhood. That's how we end food apartheid, is by investing in communities of color to be able to heal and feed themselves, right? And to amplify that at the level of the neighborhood, at the level of the city, the region, and beyond. So we are building the good food economy, and I invite people to join us in that effort, and I really applaud and support everybody else who's showing what the alternative looks like.
Wow. Beautiful way to end. Thank you very much, Clare Fox, for a great conversation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You have been listening to Flipping the Table, a podcast about food, farming, and the future. Flipping the Table is hosted by me, Michael Reed Dimmock, and produced by Patrick Sexton. Our production colleague is Doris Meyer. Our sponsors include Roots of Change and the Public Health Institute. If you have questions, comments, suggestions, or would like to sponsor Flipping the Table, please email us at comments@fthetable.com. That's comments@fthetable.com. Thank you for listening. We've been focusing on great female leaders who are making important changes in the food system. Anna LaPay, the author and activist and now philanthropist, Navina Khanna, who's trying to organize the food movement nationally through the Heal Food Alliance, and Nicolette Hahn-Nyman, who has been writing incredible books and doing great advocacy around the importance of livestock in the food system. And finally, Leah Penniman, who is an author who's written a book called Farming While Black and is the co-founder of Soulfire Farm in upstate New York. Amazing interview about her life and work. These are powerful women shaping our food, and I hope you'll listen. Thanks.